Now that we finally have our hands on the patch 2.4 version of the Fire Druid, I wanted to see if the predictions that I made in this video here would actually come to pass. And that was that even on Players 8 settings, which you are about to watch the run from, the pure Fire Druid, without an Infinity Mercenary, would absolutely devastate cows, and it's because of the changes to the global cooldown timer. So we just got done running a 6-minute Players 8 cows, and on top of that we sat there killing additional packs that were immune to both of our damage types and needed to revive our mercenary because I let him get too close to the Cow King, and we were still just a little bit over 6 minutes for a full clear of the map. Now, in my original video, we didn't have a fully decked out Druid, and now that I can actually test everything in its entirety, I wanted to show you all what my conclusions were based off the gear that's available and how to itemize your skill choices. The Crescent Moon here giving minus 35 resistance. Now our Griffins is actually stronger by plus 5 elemental damage and minus 5 lightning damage, so we didn't put a facet into here. We do have a facet inside of our Skin of the Viper Magi, and then the Ethereal Spirits, so that they actually have some FCR as well as additional plus skill, and then some additional survivability from that res. Now, on our Druid itself, we're hitting the 99 FCR breakpoint. To get there, we're using Hodo, Enigma for teleport and plus skill, Amaris for res and plus skill as well, Spirit, Alders for run walk as well as flat life, any skill rings here along with an Arachnid Mesh, and then Mage Fist has the best in slot gloves by a far margin. Across the bottom, we have Imperfect Life Skillers, as well as Res and Life, and then an Annihilus Charm and the Druid Torch. Now, the thing that really brings this build together, and I think highlights the strength of prioritizing these physical damage skills that we have, as well as Fissure, is in Flickering Flame. I built out what I think is going to be the perfect Flickering Flame for this build, and while we have a min roll in the minus enemy res, I tried to roll it a couple times, but what can you do? We have these plus 3 staff mods to Armageddon, Volcano, and Fissure. Fissure is obviously your primary AoE damage, but Armageddon gives a massive amount of fire and physical damage around you in a pretty consistent rate, as well as Volcano giving us an additional source of physical AoE damage that also buffs up our overall fire damage when we have the entirety of the screen covered in AoE damage types. On swap, we're using Call to Arms and a Spirit Monarch, just to be able to buff up ourselves as well as our Mercenary and our Summon to make them a more tanky bear for us. For skills, while I initially considered the fact that having a tank would group up monsters, thus decreasing our DPS, and in reality it does do that, I figured out that it was incredibly important to have at least 1 point down into Grizzly, and here's why. The Act 3 Mercenary being the only other target on the ground meant that if the monsters weren't looking at us, they were looking at the Merc. And when the Mercenary is targeted, they're much more likely to attempt to run as an AI decision or use Lightning in Charge Bolt. Whereas if there are no monsters targeting the Mercenary, they'll be using Static more often. The bear running out in between our teleport jumps means that the Mercenary feels basically safer more often and is using Static more often. And the reason why we're trying to use this over the Infinity Mercenary is 1, to save you some runes, and 2, because I legitimately believe that there are alternatives to what you may consider to be the quote-unquote best option, considering Static hits the entire field at maximum range. The Mercenary has an 18-yard radius on Static, and to give you an idea of how much 18 yards looks like, I'm going to very quickly draw a little circle on the screen here so you can get an idea. The top and the bottom of the screen, as well as the left and the right of the screen, are about 16.5 yards away, whereas the corners are about 22 yards away. If you're to draw an oval starting at the top of your screen, Static is going to be hitting just about 95% of the totality of your screen, and the only thing that's going to be missed with its radius are things in the absolute corners, and those monsters aren't even technically engaged at that point, and they're not even making AI decisions, so they're not walking towards you. Now, why is it so important, Mac, to try to bolster your damage with static field, and why do you keep harping on the fact that you have physical damage components to your skills? Well, to understand that, I'm just going to go give a very quick overview of a really important mechanism that you need to understand for Fissure and Volcano to figure out why you can't just cast them right on top of one another and why it might feel clunky or you're not getting as much damage as you would expect. Both Fissure and Volcano have a facet called next hit delay. Next hit delay means that if a monster is hit with a next hit delay skill, no other skills which have next hit delay can deal damage until the end of that timer. So to just give you an idea, the center of the volcano of the actual skill itself has a 10 frame next hit delay, whereas the meteors that come out of it have a 5 frame next hit delay. If a monster gets hit by the center of the volcano for 2/5 of a second, they can't take any damage. So if I were to cast Volcano and Fissure right on top of one another, when the first skill hits them, the other two components of the skill's damage won't be able to hit them for a small amount of time. And one of the problems with this is even if a monster is immune to the damage type, if they were to get hit by a next hit delay skill, they still can't take damage. So if you're fighting against a monster that's immune to fire and they walk over a fissure, they then won't take any of the physical damage from the volcano or its meteors. Now, if I put all three of our AoE effects on the field at the same time, you start to get a better idea of just how much of a radius of influence we have for dealing damage. Fissure is obviously our primary. We're going to have Armageddon around us, and then on the left side we'd have Volcano. If you space this out properly, you can quite literally hit over 70% of the screen at any one time with damage dealing ability. Now, while Fissure is absolutely fantastic, it still has a delay. You're only able to cast it once every 2 seconds. So while you're teleporting around or doing nothing with that 2 seconds, you're able to go ahead and drop a Volcano. Volcano is used to start peppering up the edge of the screen with some additional damage, as well as slightly increasing the AoE of your total fire. And you use Fissure to focus down packs. Now, the problem with Fissure is that if a monster doesn't walk over any of the torrents that open up in the ground, they do not take damage. Just because they're in the generalized area, you'll see anywhere where there isn't a fissure open, no damage is being dealt. This is why it's so important to be teleporting constantly and to be moving the packs through Fissure. A great tool that you have for moving a pack back into Fissure is actually Molten Boulder. Molten Boulder, which is going to deal physical damage and fire damage as it rolls, and then a larger amount of damage when it explodes, as well as leaving behind an AoE of fire which will do tick damage, will push monsters through Fissure. And even if a monster didn't walk, if they're knocked back into Fissure, they will take damage if they go over any of the vents that open up in the ground. What this means is that as you're playing, you get to fully cover the majority of your screen in constant AoE damage effects, meaning every single monster is taking some damage over time, and once they get clumped together, you can start focusing them with Fissure. If you have a particularly tanky monster or they're immune to fire, the static from your Mercenary, as well as their little bit of lightning damage, and your Molten Boulder is going to mean that you still have access to really good damage sources. And since Molten Boulder doesn't have next hit delay, you're actually able to drop a Volcano directly on the target and then Molten Boulder them through it. This is going to add up additional physical damage facets, along with the fact that your Bear knocks back targets into your Fissure and your Mercenary is sitting there staticking the whole time. And while most people think, well, you need to kill on player's 8, especially if you're doing density destroying, that's the only way, etc., keep in mind 2 facets. 1, the difference in drop chance between players 5 and players 7, since the increased chance of dropping is only on every odd player settings, is almost negligible. And on top of that, you really shouldn't be killing on players 8 in the first place unless you're going for experience. But considering you're not looking for experience in Hell Cows, especially when we're talking about a fully built out character, realistically, you should be down on players 5. And if you're farming this area on players 5, let me tell you, it's almost night and day just how much faster you clear out the entirety of this area. Then you add on the fact that we're at the second fastest breakpoint on the Druid, and the fact that we have multiple damage types means that we're not confined to farming specific areas, and we're not relying on Infinity to break resistances either. We walk into areas, and anything that we can kill with fire, we drop Fissure, as well as having our Armageddon tick on them. And anything that can't be damaged by fire, we drop Volcano and Molten Boulder, while our Mercenary helps to static it down. Now with Flickering Flame giving us the ability to have +6 to both Volcano and Armageddon, means that we're sitting on a level 51 skill level for both of these. So on tooltip damage, the physical damage component of Armageddon is 4k per hit, along with 9k fire damage, and then the fire damage per second persistent is about 1700 damage. On Volcano itself, you have another 1000 physical damage, as well as 2500 fire damage. Fissure is boasting a nasty 5k fire damage, and then our Molten Boulder, again, it's doing that 1500 physical damage and 1200 fire damage as it rolls through and continuously hits targets every frame. Especially on something like Cows, considering Crescent Moon and Griffins completely negates the monster's lightning resistance, the static is doing a full 25% of the remaining health every single time it ticks to the entirety of the field. So before we've even started fighting anything, most monsters are around that 60 to 66% of their remaining life before we've even started fighting them. And I just want to be very clear, I'm not attempting to make an argument that you don't benefit from infinity or minus enemy fire res, but there's this idea in the mind of the public that you need to have infinity on every single elemental build. And the fact of the matter is, that's just not true. Depending on what you're farming, where you're farming, and especially on somebody like the Druid that packs such a huge physical damage component on all of its skills, infinity isn't the end-all be-all for gear options. Considering the Griffins here is just for optimization's sake, and the other side of it too being that since the Mercenary has such high natural res, Skin of the Viper Magi isn't even the best option. Getting them something like an Ormus Robes also goes an incredibly long way of being able to increase the radius of their static. Being able to build out a budget Mercenary on an elemental build like this, where all you need is a Spirit and a Crescent Moon as the minimum gear requirements, is really, really exciting for the overall health of the new build changes that we're seeing in 2.4. I hope that when you walk into the latter season, you seriously consider building out something like the Fire Druid and come to understand the nuances that allow you to benefit the most from its physical damage components without being reliant on needing to drop the 2 Burr and an Ist into an Infinity and locking yourself in for all of the high runes that you make in the beginning of the ladder. Just to really put the cherry on top here, I'm going to go ahead and run an area that you should never take a fire build into ever, and that's the Chaos Sanctuary. I'm going to do it on players 1 because realistically on this build you should be seal popping, meaning only killing the seal bosses, and then before you kill the last one, very quickly teleporting around so that when you pop the last seal, a lot of monsters will die and you can reap the rewards of their drops before you go and kill Diablo. Just to highlight how versatile a pure fire damage build is, especially when you give them the benefit of something like static. So while we're teleporting around on seal popping, just as a quick pro tip, if you ever find a huge area of density like we found over at Grand Vizier, go ahead and drop a town portal there. That will hold those monsters in an active state so that when you seal pop, they'll actually die as well. You can see that even though Grand Vizier was a little bit finicky, once she came over, we were able to pop her almost immediately. Even on Lord Desace, where all of his minions are going to be immune to fire, you can actually still drop Fissure directly on top of him. Then when you tele-stomp him, just go ahead and drop Molten Boulder so he gets pushed through it. He should die in 2 or 3 procs in total. Now, the interesting part here was Infector. Because all of Infector's minions are immune to fire, they're going to want to actually use Volcano as your AoE, since that will do AoE physical damage. And you want to keep yourself as close to as possible so that you get the Armageddon damage up. But if you looked at the Infector that spawned, he was both immune to fire and also Stone Skin, meaning that he was immune to physical as well. Luckily, though, we had our Mercenary there doing additional damage. Now, if you had a Mercenary with Infinity on, they actually wouldn't have been able to kill this guy, because his Infinity isn't going to break the fire immunity, and he's not going to be able to deal physical damage either. But the Act 3 Mercenary is able to bring him down. Then when Diablo spawns, since he won't be running around either, here's where Volcano shines through so strong. You're able to drop it directly on top of him, dealing continuous fire and physical damage to him, Your Armageddon's going to be blasting him as well, and since he's going to be taking a look at your bear, you don't have to worry about your safety, and you can get in real close and actually drop your Firestorm on him. Then you go ahead and you just check where you had killed monsters when the seal pop went off to see if you get anything good. And hell, maybe you pick up a Lacerator, which is going to be in high demand considering Double Throw Barb is going to be absolutely nasty in 2.4. But there you have it. I think that I've made a pretty strong case for why you want to consider building the Fire Druid the way that I have here. And I hope that's gone a long way just to exemplify just how powerful your additional damage sources are, especially when you're considering the fact that while fire damage is typically huge and very powerful, Hell difficulty was built to survive fire damage. So you got to think a little bit outside of the box if you want to be successful on a fire build in 2.4. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.